Hey, and welcome to the Influential Nonprofit. I'm your host, I'm Maryanne. I work with nonprofit leaders to master the art of influence so they can ask for and receive all they want, need, and deserve without feeling rejected, ineffective, or pushy. And today we're going to talk about something that is kind of icky, but it does happen. And you can learn how to be prepared, and that is how to navigate a crisis. Now, this can be a public crisis or an internal crisis. I work with organizations when they have external crises. Somebody said something, something happened, something came to light, and they're facing a lot of scrutiny and they feel they want somebody to help navigate this. And I'm going to show you how I help clients do this. And specifically, we're going to talk about the tools that you can use to navigate and receive the information that's coming at you. Now, why are crises so difficult and really affect us as leaders and fundraisers, right? In the nonprofit space, a lot of times we feel like we are less than because we are dependent on the generosity of other people and because we work for the public good, that we're sort of, and that we don't make a profit, that we feel a little less than. And sometimes when any of us feel less than, we often overcompensate by feeling like we don't want to show anybody those cracks. So we have to be brilliant and perfect all the time, right? So anytime you feel less than, instead of like in the middle, if you feel less than, then you're going to overcompensate so you can feel more than, just so you can feel like the playing field is level. And nonprofits often get sucked up into this narrative. Now, I do feel like in the past maybe 15 years, organizations, first of all, have gotten a lot more responsive as to how to understand a crisis and navigate it, and also understand that criticism is the price of doing business. If you've read my book over the corner of my here, Courageous Communication, I talk a lot about praise and criticism and how it's really the same thing. It's other people's views of you. And what happens is we become overly dependent on praise and terrified of criticism, because that criticism is touching us, and it is creating feelings of guilt and shame. And those feelings of guilt and shame then drive us. And we think, oh, people can see that we're really not as good as we say we are. And then what happens is then we become overly dependent on praise and need everything we do to be liked and loved and seen as amazing. This happens individually to you and to me. This happens collectively to organizations, where we become overly dependent on praise and terrified of criticism. I've had my own journey with this as well. As somebody who always felt left out or left behind, I overcompensated in many, many aspects of my life just so I could be accepted as for me. Right? If you're doing or saying something interesting, if you are wanting to make change, change involves disruption. Disruption involves upsetting people. It comes with the territory. There are people who are going to like what you do and people who don't like what you do. And navigating that is just the price of doing business. In fact, taking a stand means that there are going to be people who love you and there are going to be people who don't love you, and that's okay. That means that you have a specific stand and a specific viewpoint that you are articulating. So when there's criticism, you can say, hey, at least I've had enough of a viewpoint that people are actually criticizing it. Good for us. Because what that's telling me is that you are giving your viewpoint. Because remember, underneath all this is that we can't make people like our nonprofit, and that's not our job. And as soon as you can move away from your desire to make people like you personally or make people like your nonprofit and start being authentic and connecting to those like-minded people who have your authentic, right, interests in mind, then you will start winning immediately, both personally and collectively inside your organization. because you can't make people like you. And what you wind up doing is spending all that time and energy chasing somebody who was never going to be your person, trying to find that friend or that date or that job that was never for you anyway, or that donor. They were never for you. So we don't have to worry about chasing them. We don't have to worry about making them do anything. We stay strong in our mission and our vision. We stay strong in our value, and we put that out there. We put that message out there, and we attract like minded people who share those values and that mission. Now that we have that foundation and you understand it, but what happens when you genuinely hurt somebody? And let's say this happens with the people that you love. A few years ago, an organization in my city had a very, very loved resale shop. This resale shop was well known, and it was in a really nice neighborhood, and they curated it very well. People knew this shop, they loved this shop. Well, the organization decided that this shop really didn't support their mission and took a lot of focus away from the change that they truly wanted to create. And they made the difficult decision to close the shop. Now, this is upsetting their people, right? That's when you have a crisis, so to speak, when the people who love and support you have questions or problems. Let's say an organization in my community a few years ago had a big controversy with an executive director who was mismanaging funds. That's a crisis. And that's a problem because the people who love you, who are on your side of the fence, are upset. This is when you need to deal with it. That creates a crisis. Anything else is the cost of doing business. Okay. Because you're going to spend all your time and energy trying to make everybody see your point of view. It's who gets the vote here. That is it. Is it employees? Is it board? Is it staff? Is it your supporters? Is it people in your community? Then you're going to flip into action. That is the definition of a crisis. Anything else is the price of doing business. And look at that in your life as well. Somebody's criticizing you. You get to decide if that person gets a vote or not. Okay, you get that sovereignty to decide that. Okay, now, how do we navigate a crisis? There's typically three ways we gather information, okay? And I'm going to talk about the three and the role they play in navigating a crisis or really any change. The first is your instinct. Our instinct is that base, okay? And that lives, in that root part of the brain, that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. The whole job of the instinct is to move away from pain and towards pleasure. It is impulsive, right? It doesn't think, it feels and acts. So it's a get me out of this room, or or your fight response. You're moving away from pain and towards pleasure. That is the only job of your instinct. I hear a lot of people, I think language matters. And people say, in my instinct, your instinct for me is not your intuition. It's not your gut. Your instinct is a biological, physical response from stored trauma in the body. Because what triggers your instinct or makes you want to move away from pain and towards pleasure has everything to do with that. I'm going to give you an example. It's not a crisis. It's just something that's happening in my life right now. My friend, I always talk about my friend Jim. He's my ride or die. His family has this cool little house up near a lake where close to where I live. And we've been up there quite a few times, and my husband and I really love it. I would love for my family to have a place like this. My family and Jim's family are very parallel. Okay. So we're both the youngest, like our siblings are the same age. We kind of have the same value system. There's a lot of parallels. I could see my family having a little place like this and using it a lot and absolutely loving it for a million reasons. Okay. So we went up the other day to see a home that's being auctioned. And I had a very instinctive response to being there. My husband had another instinctive response. Mine was moving away from pain, and his was moving towards pleasure. When I looked at that house, I saw a lot of projects. And because I carry the mental load of my house, which, let's be honest, a lot of us do. Um, I sometimes feel like I have a hard time keeping up. I have a lot of support in place. I'm fortunate enough, privileged enough to have, people who clean, a son who does my yard, and things like that. But even with that, it's a lot. Okay. And so I was like, this is nice, but everywhere I look, I see a project, and I don't want a place like that. Like, I want a place where we would go to relax and then go boating on the water, things like that. This would be a great getaway, not another million things on my household to-do list. Plus, I'm thinking about all the other things in this house that I'm in right now that I would like to complete. There is a list of things. My husband was, his impulse, his instinct was pleasure. Look what I could do here. Look what I could put here. Look what this is here. And I let him have that because I understand how the brain works, and that we were all in a set of emotions at that time. Right. And so I'm just letting all this happen, and I'm acknowledging how I'm feeling. I'm acknowledging how his feeling, but I'm not bringing it up. I'm just letting it be. A lot of times when a crisis happens, okay, when when something blows up, we get in all our feelings, and that instinct goes off, and the first thing we want to do is push it away, or we want to help somebody else, like either run towards the pleasure or run away from the pain. And really, that instinct, it's just the body expressing itself, and we can move through that. It's not necessarily where we get a lot of information from or where we make a lot of decisions from. It's a biochemical instinctive response, the lowest functioning we can have. So if people get upset, if people, lash out, if people run away, we're going to allow them to do that, because that allows the instinct and that impulse to move through the body so that we can get to the other two ways of making decisions. But a lot of times when you see somebody upset, when you see somebody, getting angry, it's going to trigger you, and you're going to want to stop that. But if you understand that it's just your instinct brain doing its job. If it didn't do its job, you wouldn't be alive. So yay, you're alive, and your instinct brain is doing its job. So let it happen. There are many people in our world who really don't function much above the instinct. They're moving through the world very reactionary, and their whole goal, it's like a 4-year-old, like if you look at a toddler, a young child, their whole goal is to move towards pleasure and away from pain. And that part of us takes over at that time, because when we get threatened, we move into those base parts of our brain that have been controlling or dominating since childhood. Let it flow. It's okay. Now, but the second part is the intellect, okay? So this is when it comes kind of out of the body and into the brain. And this is when um we come to a place of knowing, and we start thinking about what's happening around us. This is our mental response. Um, and this is when we are, instead of impulsively reacting, we're responding with thought. Okay, I'll go back to my house example and this property. I could see, like, we had, my husband and I, on the way drive back to St. Louis, had a very intellectual conversation about the property. What was good about it? What was bad about it? Is this the right time to buy something like this? You know, um, what would make it work for him? What would make it work for me? What were the pros and cons of the layout of the house, of the property? There was a lot of things that we just were looking at. It's also an auction. We've never done an auction before. There's different ways that this that there's different, like, there's a, like, a wood stove and baseboard. It's just different. Okay, so we had an intellectual based conversation from our head, right? In intellect, it's about I understand. I understand. So in a crisis, your intellect is that fact gathering place. Okay. If the instinct is your feeling place, the intellect is that fact gathering place. Like, what is the situation? What's the story? That's where you're gathering information. And that is the place of I understand. A lot of times in crisis, if we're not aware, we're going to let instinct rule. Like, oh, the board can't feel that way. We have to stop that. Okay, like let's let them have those feelings. Like somebody said to me once, Maryanne, I was hoping to avoid the drama. I'm like, it's not drama. It's just processing information. We have to be able to move through the feelings to get to the other side, to get to that intellectual part of our brain. So we got to let the instinct fire so we can get to the intellect. So it's okay to have emotional reactions. What we want to do, though, is that after that instinctive reaction is to come to a place of intellect, intelligence, where we can look now at all of the evidence and all of the facts. Right now, but the third way that we get information and we can manage a crisis or any kind of change is the intuition. Okay. The intuition is I know. It's not I understand, it's I know. And we really don't, in my opinion, in my experience, this is what I've seen is that especially in day-to-day business, people really aren't dialed into their intuition. They let their instincts and their intellect take over. Because sometimes in intuition, it is, I know, I get it. And it may not seem reasonable, practical, logical, but, and it's right. So sometimes now the intellect is at war with the intuitive, right? With the intuition, because the intellect is saying, but here are the facts, here's the reasonable. The intuition is like, yeah, I get that. And also, most change, most risks, most big changes in our world, that's what we're here to do. We're done in intuition. Like, I don't know what's going to happen, but I know for sure what I want to put in this world. And our intuition, that deep knowing, that comes from quiet. That comes from the space, the emptiness. That's when the divine downloads come. Have you ever been driving, and the thought comes in, or in the shower? That's where you have the brainstorm, because those are the times when your brain is slowing down to allow for the intuition. When you are in crisis mode, like right? It can be hard to access that intuition, which is why doing a daily practice of tapping into your knowing self, tapping into that higher self part of you is so important, so you can readily access it or understand it even in a difficult situation. So we have the intuition, we have the intellect, or sorry, we have the instinct, we have the intellect, and then we have the intuition. And they both play, and they all play, all three play a role in how we make decisions and navigate a difficult situation or a crisis. And also, we have to understand that what happens is then we start the battle, the crisis becomes the battle between the intellect and the intuition. And that I don't believe in the binary, right? It's either the intellect wins or the intuition wins. You say, okay, what would it look like in this situation for everyone to win? And let's say, God forbid, in your organization, there was a mismanagement of funds and a crisis ensued and a lot of trust was broken. Okay. Part of your job in leading people through this and rebuilding the trust with your donors is to allow them to move through that impulsive instinct to move away from pain and towards pleasure, and holding their hand through that journey. But the second part of it is now the intellect, right? Understanding what happened, owning up to it, and developing the messaging that you want to talk to people. But the third part about it is the intuition, is the knowing, is what are we really being called into here? What's happening that's sort of beyond what we can see, hear, feel, touch? What is beyond that? So an organization that may face a crisis, maybe they're being called into their next level of leadership. Maybe this is maybe this is that we need to dismantle something. Maybe this is changing our culture. And it's like, I know that place from I knowing, I know. And it's not like I know from here, it's like from your brain. It's like I know from my full body. Like everything is telling me this is it, right? This is the way we go. And it may not seem like intellectual or rational, but it is coming from a place of deep and wise knowing. And a lot of times boards, and I'm just going to say that that's been my experience, when there is an intuitive leader who makes decisions from a place of deep knowing, they're like, okay, yeah, but what are the facts? Okay, what are the facts? Your intellect can totally squash a really good idea because it doesn't seem practical. I'm going to go back to this house as an example. I would love a place like this for my family. Have I talked to my family about this? No, this is just my idea. And yet, intuitively, I know that something like this would be good for us. And it may not be a house because I'm looking at the higher thing, a way for us to gather a third space for us to be in. What could that look like? It could be this home that I looked at last week. It could be something else. But the intuition for me is not so much the intellect of it, this property or this property. It's how can we stay connected as a family? And is there an appropriate third space that would work as a gathering space for a very large boisterous family? That is the knowing, that is the thing that I know for sure, and that my intellect then can help me sort out the decision. I i what I see in my experience is that we do not believe as much in our intuition when I think it is the best driver and is the most capable of us creating change, because we don't have it all figured out, but we will. I think about Stray Rescue of St. Louis that I've been volunteering for since 1997. That's like, I think, a $5 million agency. They're building this $50 million shelter. Please, if I got the numbers wrong, please forgive me, but it's big stuff, okay? It was founded by a guy who would walk to work every day and see stray dogs, and he owned a groom shop, and he would bring them to his groom shop, clean them up, and get them adopted in the mid 90s. And then that became a nonprofit, and that became his. And but there was nothing practical or intellectual about starting a nonprofit, and yet he did it because he was called to it. And when we're like, it may not seem like, my instinct is like, I don't know, this could be painful. My intellect can say, is this practical? But my whole body is saying it doesn't matter because I'm serving the higher calling. This is about a higher good. And we'll figure everything else out along the way. Because as long as we are moving towards that higher calling, towards where intuition is driving us, we will arrive in the right place. I promise you 100%. So think about it, your instinct, your intellect, and your intuition. What I'm going to be working on with my colleagues, my clients in my coaching program this month is we're working on how to stay in touch with our intuition and practices to allow us to do that. And I would encourage you to do the same. And I would encourage you to instill that in the people around you. That means finding time for quietness, for reflection, for empty space, for that empty presence so that the wisdom can flow in. And in a crisis, that can be really, really hard to find because everyone's in a panic. But as a leader, remember, you set the emotional temperature. You can say, I understand everyone's upset. Let's take a deep breath, right? Let's do an energetic reset. I want everybody to, you could even lead a room through a guided meditation, whatever you have to do to allow that intuition to drop in, for people to access that, for people to understand that everything is happening for them, not to them, for their benefit. That's job number one. Everything is happening for their benefit. Okay, so instinct, intellect, intuition, your assignment, if you care to accept it, is to find very simple ways to access your intuition. And that could be turning the radio off when you're driving and just allow the empty silence. It could be, 10 minutes of meditation. It could be walking without headphones for a few minutes. Anything that cuts that out for a few minutes and allows for that divine download to come in. All right. And if you find yourself in a PR crisis, I have a guide I'd love to share with you. If you can shoot me. I don't have it as a lead magnet right now. I had to take it down, but I'm happy to share it with you. I will I'll make sure my email's in my show notes, but it's Maryanne@courageouscommunication.com. If you just shoot me an email, I will shoot you this PR crisis guide. It was written during COVID, but it's very, very, still very, very helpful. I'm happy to send you that crisis guide. Okay. And that's it for me and this episode of The Influential Nonprofit. We'll see you next time. Go out there and be influential.